Exactly. Bring the anchor talks, your boxes, Chief.
You ready? I'd say count to 10 and go.
Okay, 10. All right, we good? I am deeply concerned about the incident that occurred on April the 14th around 9:30 a.m. at 2112 South Paul Street that resulted in the loss of life to Christine Kerr and the indictment for first-degree murder of her husband, Richard Kerr. I would ask that you understand that I am unable and unwilling to share information with you as it relates to this particular incident that will remotely compromise the investigation, and at the same time, I'd ask that you be respectful of the family. So, for those reasons, I'm not going to get into any great details as it relates to that incident, other than to say that I have, as a result of my concern, as a result of that incident, have ordered an investigation by our internal affairs, and I can assure you in the community that that investigation will be very comprehensive, very detailed, very thorough. And we'll be looking at from the point where the run was dispatched to the point where the officers were directed to go there, to the point to when the officers got there, and to the point that the officers took the actions that the officers took once they arrived on the scene. You know, domestic violence is something that is departments across the country have been wrestling with as it relates to the best way to handle that. You know, as recent as mid-February this year, we had looked at our policies as it relates to dealing with domestic violence. We've made some significant changes pertaining to that, specifically when individuals are in stressful situations that could potentially be what some would call excited delirium. So obviously we're going to continue to look at our policies. We're going to look at what we've done in the past. We're going to look at the most recent policy that we put out, not necessarily as it relates to this incident, but just as it relates to domestic violence in general. And we're going to look for opportunities to see if there's some things that we can do that will perhaps mitigate these type of incidents from occurring in the future. Any questions?
Chief, can you talk about, and I know you can't comment specifically, but in general, how it works in terms of what kind of information and what kind of time frame dispatchers are either required by policy or procedure to relay information about the call to you over the radio?
Yeah, and again, I'm not going to get into the weeds of this particular incident, but obviously, as you all know, we prioritize calls, and a call that would be a domestic violence call, depending on the details of the information that the call taker gets from the individual that's calling, and how that call taker conveys that information to the dispatcher, and how the dispatcher conveys that information to the officer. That sort of will determine the urgency of the call. Sometimes it escalates from point A to point B. I mean, so there certainly is a protocol that communication has as it relates to how they handle those things, and there's certainly a protocol that we have as how we handle those things. But I would tell you it is, to some degree, is situation by situation. And obviously, as it relates to this particular incident, we're going to look at all of those nuances and determine what, if anything, went wrong from our perspective. I mean, obviously, something went wrong because someone lost their life. And what, if anything, can we do to kind of mitigate those incidents like that in the future?
Regarding when you talk about, you know, the urgency, and as you said, that can change even from point A to point B. And maybe you can't comment on this, but let's say that at point A, the information is that the gun is inside a safe, and at point B, the information becomes that the information is the gun is in a person's hands. How important is it that your officers receive that kind of information over the radio?
Well, you know, I would say that it is helpful and is important for any incident that the officers are responding to. If a situation changes, we want them to be abreast of the changes as it relates to that. I mean, that will determine how many officers that we send. That will determine the expediency necessarily when they get there. And that's for any kind of call that we would go to. I mean, we could get a call going to something that could be very minor as a larceny, but it could escalate to something that could end up being a robbery. So it is very important that communication plays a significant part as it relates to officers receiving information.
As a policy chief, can you go into how the department changes its response when drugs are involved in combining with the domestic violence?
Well,
How does that change how the
Well,
officers
it,
respond?
again, you know, we sort of would have to weigh each of those on its own merit. I mean, some scenarios it might not be of significance. Some scenarios it might be very significant. It just depends on the particular scenario, and it depends on the information that's being transmitted from the person that's calling to the caller, to the communication, to the dispatcher, to the police officer. So, you know, while there is a general set of priorities, how we respond to certain calls and how we prioritize those, all of those are subject to be mitigated based on the scenario at that particular time.
Chief, do you think the response time was too long, 12 minutes?
I mean, again, it just depends. You know, I would like this response time to be 30 seconds, but realistically, you know, we're an agency, they're going to hundreds of thousands of calls a year, and that's why it's so important that we prioritize those calls. As it relates to this particular incident, I am not going to, as I had mentioned, I'm not going to speak to something that I don't have all the facts to until I get the investigation, and I'm not going to speak to something that would remotely compromise that investigation. So if you're asking me that question as it relates to this incident, I'm not in a position to answer that right now.
Have you heard the call? Have you heard the 911?
I'm very familiar with the call.
You've listened to the tape?
Yeah, I haven't listened to all parts of it, but I am extremely familiar with it.
From what you know about the tape, can you walk us through the timeline? When did she indicate there was a firearm involved? When did she indicate that
Okay.
she was being threatened by that
Okay,
firearm? Can you walk us through that?
Again, I am not in a position to speak to the particulars of that, because that could somehow have an impact on the successful outcome prosecution of this, and I'm not going to do that.
Chief, what priority level would this call have been? Would it be categorized as domestic violence?
You know, again, that is, as it relates to this particular incident, I really ask that you all be very mindful of that. I'm just not going to be, other than pretty much what I've shared with you. Right now is not the time to discuss that. Now, once this has come to a conclusion, and provided that we're not going to do anything to be disrespectful to the family, I gladly share those particulars with you. But, you know, this is an ongoing investigation, and I just can't get into anything that would remotely compromise that. And some of the questions that you're asking me would really put us in a position that could potentially compromise the investigation.
Can you
Chief,
say
it's a
Yes, sir.
question that goes to protocol when someone is on a 911 call. Is the protocol to keep them on the line until officers get there, or is there ever a point where somebody might advise a person to leave the premise?
It's a great question. Again, it's situational. There might be times where we want them to stay on the line. There might be times where they would be encouraged to vacate the premise. It just, you know, it's just a situational by situational scenario, and you know, we have to, you know, take each of those scenarios and make decisions based on what the individual and what we're being confronted with at that particular time.
Chief,
Yes, sir.
how difficult is it to assess a response time in a case where, in general, a situation escalates, maybe even slowly, so that you don't really know, you know, at what point in the timeline it became more and more serious because it was slowly happening? When you look back at something, how do you tell whether it was too long or too short, when in fact it had changed throughout that time?
Well, you know, our officers have phenomenal training. Our dispatchers have phenomenal training. Us as managers are well trained and a lot of experiences doing this. So, I feel comfortable, if you're speaking about this case, once we get the investigation, we'll be able to make some definitive conclusions as it relates to what was appropriate, what wasn't appropriate, just like we do on any other scenario that we're confronted with.
Chief, what reassurance can you give someone right now that if they were to place a 911 call, they're getting the best, the fastest response that you guys can give?
I think if you look at the hundreds of thousands of calls that we have responded to, that we respond to every single year, I would say that 99 and 9/10 of the time we get it right. And then there are times where we don't get it right, and when we don't get it right, then it becomes my responsibility. If it's an issue with the police department, if it's an issue with communication, it becomes that director's responsibility to correct it. I think if you just go on our history, I think that you will see that we have a very consistent reputation for handling calls the proper way. 99% of the time.
But when you do look at the history, it shows that it's been almost a minute increase in the last 3-4 years for all responses, if you're looking at.
Yeah, you know, and again, be mindful, in 2008, we had 1,551 police officers. 2012, 2013, we had less than 1,300 police officers, which really speaks to part of the reason why we made some significant organizational changes. And I will tell you, as a result, and this is factual, as a result of the organizational changes that we've made, we've mitigated the response time from being worse than what it would have been if we had not made those changes. You know, fortunately, our citizens supported 2A. Our mayor has made public safety a priority. We've hired 100 police officers in 2013. We're in the process of hiring 110 police officers in 2015. I suspect that hiring will continue into 2015. So, I mean, I think our reorganization realized the importance of having officers out in those precincts, and part of their responsibility is responding for calls. And I think we've done a better job at doing that, despite what our resources were. And I think as this group of 200 police officers eventually graduate and get out on the street and patrol alone, how we allocate them will also, in the long run, impact positively our response time as it relates to responding for calls. There are a lot of other things that we're trying to get out of police officers in addition to response time, but response time is certainly one of those things that we certainly take a look at.
Sir,
Chief, can you explain how it works in terms of, because it seems to me you have the call takers and the dispatchers and their response, and then you have your officers and their response based partially on this person. Do the dispatchers and call takers, are they under you?
No.
Whose responsibility are they?
They're under the Director of Communications. But, you know, the bottom line as a citizen is, you know, if I'm a citizen and I call 911, I don't care about this whole little protocol. I want to know how long does it take from the time I call to the time the police get there. Now, us internally, we have to look at those things. So we have to look at from the time of his call to the call taker, to the time the call taker transmitted that to the community, to the dispatcher, and from the time the dispatcher sent it to the police officer. Now, part of my responsibility, or our responsibility as the police department, is we want to know how long it took our officers from the time that they were dispatched to get that to that particular call. But from a city perspective, and we also are concerned about from the time that it was actually called, how long it took the officer to get there. But I mean, from a managerial perspective, as it relates to our specific responsibility, we're dealing with from the time the officer got the call until the time the officer got to the scene. And then if there's some other issues that delay that in the communication part, then obviously we have a conversation with communications to say, hey, you know what, we need to, these are some of the challenges that we're having, and this is how you impact us, or these are some of the things that we can do different. Yes, say.
I have a feeling, I know what you're going to say, but at this point, I mean, can you give a breakdown of just even rough times between, you know, time the call is placed, how long to held the queue?
How did you start the sentence? Okay.
Can't blame a girl for asking. Chief, any officers been placed on leave while you guys investigate what happened?
No, absolutely not.
Have any dispatchers?
That I don't know. Communication is, again, as you had mentioned, is not directly under me. So that I don't know at this particular time.
So why are you launching an internal investigation if you feel like, you know, protocols were filed or were followed, that the response time is within?
You know, I would tell you, any significant incident that occurs, we have a responsibility to look into how we handle it. I mean, someone lost their life as it relates to this. A lot of questions. You all have raised a lot of questions. Citizens in the community raised a lot of questions. It's really why I felt compelled to have this press conference to let people know that, hey, we are very concerned about this, concerned to the point where I have ordered an investigation from the point of dispatch to the point of arrival and what actions were taken. I'm not giving you the outcome of that investigation because I don't have that outcome, but it is certainly something that I think that we have a responsibility to look at. And we do that on a lot of calls, by the way. It's just that given this particular incident, I wanted to make sure that the community knew that that is something that we're looking at.
When would you expect to have results from that investigation?
Well, if your real question is when will I be able to talk about this again with any specific details, it would probably be after this matter has been resolved in the criminal justice system.
Someone kind
kind of got to this before, but we've now seen 2 stories this week where documents show in this one, there was some edible use ahead of time and the wife states he was hallucinating. And then in another story where a young man jumped off, you know, a balcony because of, they believe, because of edibles. Does that, all of this, as we're going along with this marijuana and the recreational use of it, does that change the way you guys look at policies or protocol and how you take into consideration call when you're receiving something?
You know, and that is again, that's a great question, and that is absolutely something that we need to look at as we go forward. You know, how we prioritize when we decide we're going to use this priority versus that priority, and we need to. So do we need to factor in the fact that drugs is being used, or factor in the fact that how somebody's behaving as it relates to that? All of those things will be part of this investigation and will help us make decisions as we go forward.
How do you tackle that?
Well, I mean, we look at the particulars. We try to put some significance to how each action contribute to the outcome of the incident, and how we can be impacted by that, if we can be impacted as it relates to us being more effective in doing that, and make a decision based on that.
What about the dispensary? Have they ever been in trouble before? Are they under investigation now?
Again, that I don't know. I mean, we haven't gotten that far down the road. You know, if you're asking, did the individual purchase the drugs legally? What role did the dispensaries play in that? Haven't gotten that far down the road yet, so I don't know the answer to that.
And Chief, you may not know the answer to this either, but again, I grew up in the S. You know, because we've had 2 high-profile cases, this case, and then the one where the guy jumped off the roof where we had edible marijuana. Anecdotally, have your officers on the street noticed any weirdness involving people when they respond to a call and they've been ingesting edible marijuana?
Well, if so, other than those 2 incidents, it hadn't gotten to my attention. And again, you know, be mindful that retail marijuana only went into effect as recent as January. So I think over the course of time, I think that picture becomes a little clearer as it relates to individuals that are consuming marijuana, edibles, how that's impacting their behavior, how that impacts, once we're called, how that should impact how we should respond to that. So I think over time that picture will become much clearer, but we're in the very early stages of the edibles as it relates to retail marijuana.
Chief, you said you review calls all the time. How many times has Internal Affairs been called in for similar situations, reviewing a response time?
Probably dozens. If I had to take a guess, I mean, we will, over the course of a year or so, I mean, if there's ever any questions, or we want to make sure something is really done very objectively and very thoroughly, and it rises to the magnitude of something like this where someone loses their life, and if I think it's appropriate, I'll certainly will have Internal Affairs do that. Now, they've done it not necessarily for something that has risen to this level, but I've directed them to look at some of our actions as it relates to response times and calls in the past.
Can you quantify or describe how District 3 was that night? I mean, was it where you guys slammed, or was it a busy night, calm night?
Again, that will probably be part of the long-term investigation. So I kind of want to hold off on that. And I would just ask, just be patient a little while longer. I realize my responsibility to you, to the media, to the community, to share as much information as possible as it relates to this, and what we did, why we did it, and what role that played, and what we do every single day. But again, I'd just be mindful of, right now, my first priority is making sure that there's investigation, that we don't do anything to compromise the successful conclusion of that investigation, and at the same time that we're very respectful of the family members.
You know, District 3 is now the biggest district, because I know you sort of changed the lines over the last few years. Are you, with your new recruits that are coming out, are you guys going to beef up that district? Because, we're hearing a lot of guys say they just can't get to these calls quick enough because it's too big.
Well, I think District 3 was probably always geographically the largest district. And we redistrict, we precinct, and we did that based on a couple things. We did that based on the boundaries. We want to make sure that we kept neighborhood integrity to the extent that we had major streets not being where it was possible to avoid them being split between 2 districts, the number of calls for service, what drives police service. So we redistrict, reallocated, we precinct based on what drives calls for service. District 3 is a busy district. It's not the busiest district. District 6 is actually probably the busiest district. District 3 get certain kind of calls that District 6 doesn't get, that District 4 doesn't get. So I think, given our resources, I'm very comfortable that we've allocated them very effectively. And as the officers come out of the academy, we do a review of what's driving police services in all 6 of those districts and make a determination to allocate those resources according to what drives police services.
So you base your staffing on calls, not how long it's gonna take them to get there, not like geography?
No, we base it on all of those things. We base it on the size of the district, the direction of traffic as it flows in the district, the types of calls the district, how much time also has to spend on a call. You spend a lot more time on a traffic accident than you would perhaps taking a larceny report, so we factor that in. Neighborhood integrity, business integrity. There are a lot of nuances that we take in consideration when we do that. I mean, that is a very thorough look at what drives police services before we allocate those officers.
Chief, in a call, can you explain to me, there's this conversation between dispatch and an officer. And normally it's the dispatcher telling the officer what's going on until an officer gets to a scene. Why might an officer be telling a dispatcher what's happening? Is there a note that they can read as it's going on, or?
Yeah, I mean, officers have mobile digital terminals in their cars, but that information is in the car. It's coming from the dispatcher. So I mean, there might be a time where a dispatcher might try to direct an officer to do something. The officer might have a better understanding of more history of a particular incident or a particular location, and either the officer or preferably the sergeant would redirect some action being taken. So that's not necessarily that unusual, particularly as it relates to the sergeant.
Could there be 2 dispatchers on the line at the same time?
That I don't know.
Do you have any rules about whether your officers, I mean, you know, it's illegal to like text and drive. So if you're an officer and you're driving to a scene and somebody's sending you notes on a computer, do you have any policies about how often you're supposed to look at the computer, or should crucial information be radioed?
Well, I mean, I want you to imagine, it would be very challenging to drive and to look while you're driving. That's not necessarily the safest way of doing that. So what we actually encourage, or what we should be encouraging, I mean, they look at those terminals, but it certainly should not be while they're driving.
Can I just ask you point blank what role you think Pop played in this?
I don't know the answer to that. And hopefully, as this unveils, we'll be able to clearly kind of define that. Okay, great. I really appreciate your call, and thanks for your understanding.